At my son's wedding, his bride introduced me as unemployed in front of 200 guests. In that moment, it felt as if my heart had been ripped out with bare hands. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I'd share. And if, for just a second, you feel like this sounds familiar, I only ask that you leave a like and subscribe. It will help me to keep unburdening myself. My name is Teresa Miller. I'm 63 years old, and that September afternoon in Napa Valley was supposed to be the happiest day of my life. I had waited for this moment for decades, to see my only son, Ethan, marry the woman of his dreams. I woke up at 5 in the morning to do my hair, carefully twisting my silver gray hair into an elegant bun I had practiced in front of the mirror for weeks. My navy blue dress with small embroidered flowers had been hand-stitched by me, stitch by stitch, during the lonely nights in my small sewing room. The Sterling Vineyard, just outside of St. Helena, glowed like a postcard under the golden afternoon sun. The vines stretched to the horizon, creating green waves that seemed to sway in the warm breeze. Crystal chandeliers hung from ancient oak trees, and white rose petals carpeted the path leading to the makeshift altar among the ripe grapes. Everything smelled of lavender and new promises. I arrived alone, as always. My 2005 Honda Civic, with its worn-out seats and a radio that only worked on odd-numbered days, was out of place among the Teslas, Mercedes, and BMWs that filled the gravel parking lot. The uniformed valets looked at me with curiosity as I got out, carrying the embroidered cloth handbag that had belonged to my mother. There was no one waiting for me. I walked down the stone path, feeling my low-heeled shoes, the only elegant pair I owned, sink slightly into the damp earth. All around me, entire families greeted each other with effusive hugs and kisses. Men in designer suits shook hands while their wives, dressed like magazine models, compared jewelry that sparkled brighter than the evening lights. At the entrance, a young event coordinator with a gold clipboard and a porcelain smile stopped me with a gaze that scanned me from head to toe like a security scanner. "Are you the lady who helps with the cleaning at the groom's house?" she asked in a voice that was melodious but cold. The words hit me like invisible slaps. I swallowed hard, feeling my throat go dry. "I'm Teresa Miller, Ethan's mother." Her face turned a deep shade of pink, but not from shame, from discomfort. "Oh, I'm so sorry, Mrs. Miller. It's just, well, we didn't have you on the main family list. You were placed on the special guests list." Special guests. As if I were a distant aunt or a childhood neighbor. Not the woman who had carried Ethan in her womb for 9 months, who had stayed up all night when he had a fever, who had sold homemade savory pies near the university campus to pay for his engineering degree. She handed me a small card with my name misspelled, Ms. Teresa, Table 15. Table 15 was all the way in the back, next to the service columns, where the clatter of waiters and dishes drowned out conversation. My seat was between someone's great aunt, who could barely stay awake, and a distant cousin who spoke to no one. As I made my way to my seat, I passed the main tables. Claudia's family occupied the first 4. Parents, siblings, aunts, uncles, cousins, all dressed as if they had stepped out of a society magazine. Their conversations revolved around their trips to Aspen, their summer homes in the Hamptons, and the family businesses that kept them comfortable. At the head table, next to where the bride and groom would sit, I saw an empty seat with a card that read, Father of the Groom. Ethan had lost his father when he was 12, and for decades, that place had been mine at every family celebration. But tonight, no one had thought to save it for me. I sat down in my white plastic chair. The other tables had upholstered wooden chairs, and watched as the guests greeted each other with familiarity. No one came over to introduce themselves. No one offered me a glass of champagne. When the waiters passed with trays of hors d'oeuvres, they seemed to look right through me, as if I were transparent. My phone buzzed in my purse. A text from Ethan. "Mom, you made it? Everything okay?" I replied, "I'm here, sweetie. Everything is beautiful. I love you." I didn't tell him I felt like a stranger at my own son's wedding. I didn't tell him I'd been sitting alone for an hour, watching his new family treat me like an inconvenient obligation. Because I still believed he didn't know, that when he found out, he would come find me and take me to the main table where I belonged. But Ethan never came. When the lights dimmed and the ceremony began, from my spot in the last row, I could barely see his face. I watched him walk toward the altar with Claudia on his arm, she radiant in her French lace gown that cost more than I made in 2 years, and he smiling, nervous, happy. In that moment, as I watched them exchange vows of eternal love under the golden lights, I felt a strange pang in my chest. It was as if I were watching the life of a stranger, as if the years I had dedicated to raising him, the sacrifices, the sleepless nights, the meals I skipped so he could eat, had all been just a dream. My son was getting married, and I was a spectator in the nosebleed seats of his happiness. As the couple kissed under a shower of white petals, my mind flew backward like leaves in the wind. I remembered when Ethan was 8 and got pneumonia. I was working at the Garcia textile factory, sewing from 6 in the morning until 10 at night for a meager salary. When he got seriously ill, I asked for time off to take him to the hospital. My boss told me to choose my job or my son. I chose Ethan. I lost my job that same week. For 3 months, I sold savory hand pies I made in my tiny kitchen, getting up at 4 in the morning to knead the dough with my cracked hands. I would carry a wicker basket and walk the brick streets of the historic downtown, shouting homemade pies, freshly baked, until my voice gave out. Tourists bought them out of pity, and the university students came because my pies were cheap and filling. Ethan slowly recovered, but I lost so much weight that my neighbors began to whisper that I looked like a ghost. My hands, once soft from sewing fine silks, became calloused and cut from kneading relentlessly. But he got better, and that was all that mattered. When he got a scholarship to study engineering at Penn State, I cried for hours in the bathroom so he wouldn't see me. Not from sadness. From relief. My sacrifice had been worth it. My boy was going to be someone. He was going to have what I could never give myself. The first years of college were the hardest. Ethan lived in a dorm that cost $800 a month, plus books, food, clothes. I had found work in an under-the-table sewing workshop where they paid us per finished piece. I sewed party dresses for rich women who never knew who made them. My fingers would bleed some nights, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. I remember one December afternoon when Ethan called me crying. His classmates had organized a spring break trip to Paris. $1,500 that I didn't have, not even in my wildest dreams. "Don't worry about it, Mom," he told me, his voice breaking. "It's not important. I can just stay here and study." That night, I sold my Singer sewing machine, the only inheritance my mother had left me, an antique 1952 Singer, black with gold details, which had sewn the linens for 3 generations of women in my family. I sold it for $300 to an antique dealer who knew exactly what it was worth, but took advantage of my desperation. With that $300 and another $200, I borrowed from my neighbor, Grace, money that took me 8 months to pay back. Ethan was able to go to Paris with his friends. He sent me a photo from the Eiffel Tower, smiling with his college buddies, all dressed in expensive coats and brand-name scarves. He was wearing the coat I had bought for him at a thrift store and had mended 3 times because the sleeves were coming apart. "Thanks, Mom. You're the best," he wrote under the photo. For 4 years while he studied, I lived on a few $100s a month. For breakfast, I had coffee and toast. For lunch, lentil soup. For dinner, whatever was left in the fridge. My shoes had holes in the soles, but I'd patch them with cardboard to make them last longer. My winter coat was the same one I'd worn for 10 years, mended with patches I sewed myself. On Sundays, Ethan would come home from his dorm with dirty laundry and an empty mini fridge. I would cook for hours. Beef stew, chili, meatloaf, homemade mac and cheese. I'd fill his backpack with Tupperware containers of food to last him the week. He would leave with a full stomach, and the fridge at home would be practically empty until his next visit. I never held it against him. I never told him that sometimes I went to bed without dinner so he could take an extra container of stew. He was my son. It was my responsibility. It was my love. When he graduated with honors, the ceremony was at the university's main auditorium. I sat in the last row, wearing my good dress, the same navy blue one I was wearing now at his wedding, and cried with pride when they called his name. Ethan Miller, Industrial Engineering, summa cum laude. My son had made it. It had all been worth it. After graduation, we went to dinner at a modest restaurant downtown. Ethan ordered wine to celebrate, and as we toasted, he took my hand and said, "Mom, when I get a job, I'm going to buy you a new house. I'm going to give you everything you deserve. I will never forget what you've done for me." Those words sustained me for the following years. When he found a job at a multinational corporation and moved to New York City. When he started earning more in a month than I had seen in a whole year. When he met Claudia at a business conference and told me, excitedly, that he had found the love of his life. The first time he introduced me to Claudia was at an elegant restaurant in Manhattan, the kind where waiters wore white gloves and every dish looked like a work of art. I had taken a 4-hour bus ride, wearing my best dress and my nerves on edge. I wanted to make a good impression on the woman who had won my son's heart. Claudia arrived half an hour late, wearing a dress that probably cost more than 3 months of my rent. She was beautiful. I couldn't deny it. Blonde, tall, with that natural elegance that only people born into comfort possess. But from the first moment, something in her eyes unsettled me. The way she looked me up and down, as if assessing whether I deserved to be in the same space as her. "So you're the famous Teresa," she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Ethan has told me so much about you, about your situation, my situation, as if being a single working mother was a contagious disease." Throughout the dinner, Claudia talked about her job at an international marketing firm, her travels through Europe, her well-positioned family in the business world. She casually mentioned that her father owned 3 companies and that her mother was the president of the most exclusive tennis club in the city. When she asked what I did for a living, and I told her about my small sewing business from home, she nodded condescendingly. "How charming. Manual labor has a certain rustic appeal," she said, as if talking to a child who had just shown her a crayon drawing. Ethan didn't notice, or didn't want to. He was so in love that he seemed blind to Claudia's small cruelties, to her poisoned comments disguised as compliments. The following months were a series of subtle slights that my son never seemed to notice. When I turned 60, Claudia organized a small family gathering at her place, but she forgot to invite me until the day before. "Oh, Teresa, it completely slipped my mind. But please come, of course. We've already planned for 8 people, but I'm sure we can squeeze you in." I arrived with a homemade cake I had baked myself, decorated with fresh strawberries and pastry cream. Claudia accepted it with a forced smile. "What a nice thought. I'll put it in the kitchen with the other desserts I ordered from the French patisserie." My cake never made it to the table, or when Ethan moved into Claudia's apartment, a penthouse on the Upper East Side with a terrace overlooking Central Park. I went to visit him once, carrying a bag of homemade food as I always did. Claudia met me at the door. "Teresa, what a surprise. Ethan is on a very important video call, but you can leave the food in the kitchen and go. I'll tell him you stopped by." I stood there on the threshold, holding my bag of Tupperware, feeling like a door-to-door salesperson who had just been dismissed without a glance at her wares. "I thought maybe I could wait for him," I murmured. "It's just that it's going to be a while, you know? And we have plans tonight. Maybe another day." I left the food and went home. On the bus back to Harrisburg, I cried silently as I watched the golden fields of Pennsylvania fly by. An elderly woman sitting next to me offered me a tissue without a word. But what hurt most was the change in Ethan. His visits became more and more sporadic. The phone calls grew shorter. When we spoke, he always seemed to be in a hurry, always had something more important waiting for him. His answers became monosyllabic. "Yes, Mom. No, Mom. Talk to you later, Mom." That Christmas, they invited me for dinner at 11 at night, after they had celebrated with the real family, as Claudia called her parents. I arrived when they had already finished the main course and only dessert was left. I sat in a chair that had clearly been added last minute, as it didn't match the rest of the dining set. The conversation revolved around topics I couldn't follow: stock market investments, ski trips in the Swiss Alps, summer home renovations. When I tried to share something about my work or my neighbors, an awkward silence would fall, as if I had interrupted an adult conversation. "Mom does beautiful embroidery," Ethan said at one point, clearly trying to include me. "How interesting!" exclaimed Claudia's mother with false enthusiasm. Do you sell it at craft fairs? Craft fairs. As if I were some hippie selling trinkets on the street. But the hardest blow came the day I decided to pay them a surprise visit. I had finished an embroidered tablecloth especially for them, with their initials intertwined and small fleur-de-lis that had taken me 2 months to complete. I wanted to give it to them as an engagement gift, as they had just announced they were getting married. I arrived at their apartment on a Saturday morning and heard voices on the terrace. I didn't want to interrupt, so I waited by the entrance. But the words carried clearly through the glass door. "I don't understand why you have to invite her to everything," Claudia was saying. "It's awkward, Ethan. She doesn't fit in with our circle. She's my mother, Claudia." "I know, honey. But look at you now. Look at what we've achieved together. You're an executive at a multinational. I run my own department. We socialize with important people. And well, she's still living in her little world in Harrisburg, sewing to get by." There was a silence that lasted an eternity. "Besides," Claudia continued, "when we have children, do you want them to grow up thinking it's normal to live with such a lack of ambition? Children need examples of success, not complacency. Complacency. My entire life of sacrifice summed up in one derogatory word. I waited to hear Ethan's voice defending me. I waited for his words of love and gratitude. I waited for him to tell that woman that without my complacency, he would never have gotten where he was. But all I heard was, "You're right. Sometimes it's complicated. Complicated." I was complicated for my own son. I left without giving them the tablecloth. I stored it in the back of my closet, wrapped in tissue paper, like a secret too painful to be revealed. I couldn't sleep that night. I sat in my wicker chair, the same one where I had sewn for years to support him, looking out the window at the empty streets of Harrisburg under the yellow glow of the streetlights. For the first time in decades, I wondered if I had done something wrong, if all my love, all my sacrifices, had been a mistake. If instead of raising a grateful son, I had raised a man who was ashamed of his origins. The months leading up to the wedding were like walking on broken glass. Every conversation with Ethan was a careful negotiation where I tried not to seem complicated. When he told me about the preparations, I would nod and smile, even though every detail reminded me how far I was from his priorities. "Claudia wants the ceremony to be very elegant, Mom. You know how she is. She likes everything to be perfect." Perfect. A word that apparently did not include me. The wedding dress cost $3,000. It's from a French designer. And the reception will be at the most exclusive vineyard in the area. 200 guests. 200 guests. I knew 5 of them. "What about my dress, son? Do you have any preference?" An awkward silence on the other end of the line. "I don't know, Mom. Something discreet, I guess." Discreet. Invisible. Out of the way. Claudia personally oversaw every aspect of the wedding, except one: what to do with me. A week before the ceremony, I received a call from her. Her voice sounded sweet, but there was a venomous undertone. "Teresa, dear, I need to talk to you about a few details. So everything goes perfectly, you know?" She explained that she had assigned one of her cousins the task of accompanying me during the event. "So you don't feel lonely," she said. But I understood the real message: to watch me, to make sure I didn't do anything to embarrass the family. She also informed me that she had prepared a little speech where she would mention me. "Nothing long, don't worry. Just a few nice words about family." "Could I see it beforehand?" I asked with a strange premonition. "Oh no, it's a surprise. Trust me." That night, as I was ironing my navy blue dress for the 3rd time, trying to make it look less worn, the doorbell rang. It was my neighbor Grace, the same one who had lent me money years ago for Ethan's trip to Paris. "Teresa, are you all right? You've been looking very pale lately." Grace was 70 and had the wisdom of someone who had raised 4 children on her own. She sat in my small kitchen and made me a chamomile tea while I told her about my fears for the wedding. "Honey," she said, taking my rough hands in hers, "sometimes children forget where they come from when they fly too high. But that doesn't mean the love we gave them was in vain." "But what if I embarrass myself, Grace? What if I say the wrong thing? What if I don't know how to act around those people? You raised a successful engineer by working in a factory and selling hand pies. You can handle anything, Teresa Miller." But her words, though full of kindness, couldn't calm the anxiety growing in my chest like a poisonous weed. The morning of the wedding, as I dressed in front of the cracked mirror in my bedroom, I saw a 63-year-old woman with wrinkles etched by work and worry, hands permanently stained from years of sewing, and eyes that had cried more tears than one life should hold. My navy blue dress, though clean and well-pressed, couldn't hide its age or my humble origins. "You'll be fine," I told myself out loud. "You're the mother of the groom. You have a right to be there." But for the first time in my life, I didn't believe my own words. The drive to the wedding was silent torture. In my 2005 Honda Civic, with its broken radio and an air conditioner that made more noise than breeze, I followed the GPS directions while much more luxurious cars overtook me on the highway. Every Mercedes, every Tesla that passed me was a reminder of the distance that separated my world from the one my son now belonged to. When I arrived at the vineyard and saw the lavish display, I felt the air leave my lungs. The flowers must have cost more than 6 months of my rent. The uniformed waiters moved like dancers among tables decorated with crystal that gleamed in the afternoon sun. Everything smelled of expensive perfume and success. And there, in the midst of this perfection, was I, Teresa Miller, the woman who had raised the groom with love and sacrifice, but who now seemed like a typo on the page of a society magazine. As I walked toward the entrance, clutching my embroidered cloth bag, I felt all eyes on me like pins. The whispers started before I even reached the door. "Who's that woman? Looks like someone's grandmother. Isn't she a little old to be here?" The event coordinator stopped me with her plastic smile and humiliating questions. But what hurt the most wasn't her confusion. It was realizing that at my own son's wedding, I looked so out of place that it was logical to mistake me for the help. I walked to table 15 with trembling legs and a shrunken heart. Around me, families greeted each other warmly, took photos, laughed with the complicity of those who share social codes and common references. I was the only one walking alone, the only one with no one to introduce me to other guests, the only one who sat in silence waiting for a ceremony to begin where my role would be limited to a passing mention. At my table, the great aunt who was nodding off and the distant cousin who spoke to no one greeted me with polite but distant smiles. We were the misfits, the ones who didn't fit into any other category but had to be placed somewhere. "Are you family of the bride or the groom?" the cousin asked me. "I'm Ethan's mother," I replied, and saying it out loud, it almost sounded like an apology. The cousin nodded with poorly concealed surprise. He clearly hadn't expected the groom's mother to be at the table for the outcasts. When the ceremony ended and the cocktail hour began, I watched from afar as Ethan and Claudia received congratulations from all the guests. An endless line of elegant people came up to hug them, take photos, and toast to their happiness. I waited my turn, standing by my table with a glass of champagne that no one had offered me but that I had taken from a distracted waiter's tray. When the line finally shortened and I could approach my son, I hugged him with all the tenderness I had stored up during months of feeling rejected. He smelled of expensive cologne and happiness. His suit was impeccable, his smile radiant. "Mom, you look beautiful," he said. But his eyes were already scanning over my head for more important guests who needed his attention. "Son, I'm so proud of you. The ceremony was lovely. Thanks, Mom. Claudia took care of everything. She has great taste, doesn't she?" Claudia appeared by his side as if summoned. Her wedding dress looked like something out of a fairy tale, and her makeup was perfect despite having cried tears of joy during the vows. "Teresa, so glad you could make it," she exclaimed with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I hope you're having a good time. I saw they put you at a very quiet table." Quiet? That was her elegant way of saying, out of the way. "Everything is beautiful, Claudia. You've done a magnificent job. Thank you. It was a lot of work, but I think it was worth it. By the way, I have a little surprise planned for later. A speech where I'll mention the whole family." She smiled at me with what looked like sweetness, but there was something in her eyes that put me on edge, like a cat playing with a mouse before the kill. "We should get back to greeting the guests," Ethan said, giving me a quick kiss on the cheek. "See you later, Mom." And they left, leaving me alone in the middle of the garden while photographers followed them to capture every moment of their perfect day. I didn't appear in any of those photos. I returned to my table and watched the celebration unfold around me. Claudia's parents, a distinguished couple who looked like they were out of a period film, moved among the tables like natural hosts, greeting everyone with the confidence of those born to it. The father wore a suit that probably cost more than my annual rent, and the mother wore jewels that sparkled brighter than the evening lights. At one point, Claudia's mother approached my table. She was an elegant woman in her 50s, with perfectly coiffed hair and a smile that seemed rehearsed in a mirror. "You must be Teresa," she said in a melodious voice. "I'm Caroline, Claudia's mother. I've heard so much about you." "I hope good things," I replied, trying to sound relaxed. "Of course. Claudia told me you sew very well. Such a useful talent." "Useful? As if I were a tool." "She also told me you live alone in Harrisburg. It must be peaceful, though I imagine a bit lonely." "I manage just fine," I murmured. Of course. And it's wonderful that Ethan has found his place in New York. Young people need to expand their horizons, don't you think? Get out of the environment they grew up in." Every word was a small, poisoned dart. Caroline knew exactly what she was doing, and I knew I didn't have the weapons to defend myself. "Well, I'll let you enjoy your dinner," she said finally. "I'm sure it will be a different experience for you." Different. Another word that meant I didn't belong here. Dinner began with the sound of clinking glasses and lively conversations filling the warm night air. From my table in the back, I watched as waiters served dishes that looked like works of art. Octopus carpaccio with caviar, smoked salmon with herbs I didn't recognize, spring lamb with sauces that probably had French names. At my table, conversation was minimal. The great-aunt had fallen asleep after the first course, and the distant cousin seemed more interested in his phone than in socializing. I ate in silence, savoring flavors I had never tasted before, wondering how much each bite had cost. That's when the speeches began. First, Claudia's father spoke, a portly man with a radio announcer's voice who told funny anecdotes about his daughter's childhood and her academic and professional achievements. People laughed and applauded at the right moments. Then, a friend of Ethan's from college spoke, recalling youthful antics and joking about how Claudia had managed to tame the most committed bachelor in their graduating class. More laughter, more applause. Finally, Claudia took the microphone. She looked radiant under the lights, like a movie star on her premiere night. Her voice was clear and melodious as she began to speak about love, about shared dreams, about the bright future they had ahead of them. "I want to thank my entire family," she said, "for giving me the tools to get here. My parents for teaching me that excellence is non-negotiable. My brothers for always challenging me to be better. My grandparents who, although they're no longer with us, taught me that hard work and a vision for the future are the foundation of success." A pause for applause. I clapped too, though I wasn't sure why. "And of course," Claudia continued, "I also want to thank my husband's family, especially his mother, Teresa, who is here with us tonight." All eyes turned to me. I felt the blood rush to my cheeks as I smiled nervously and gave a little wave. "Teresa," Claudia went on, "is a woman who has done the best she could with what she had. We know it hasn't been easy for her, especially now that, let's just say she has a lot of free time." A murmur spread through the room. Some people chuckled quietly. "She isn't currently working and doesn't do much else, but I'm sure she's very proud to see how her son has achieved so much. It's inspiring to see how Ethan managed to overcome the limitations of his background and build something so successful." The words struck me like slaps. One after another, each sentence carefully crafted to humiliate me with elegance. Claudia kept talking, but I was no longer listening. The sound of my own blood rushing in my ears drowned out everything else. Unemployed. Limitations of his background. Doesn't do much else. I looked toward the head table, searching for Ethan's eyes, hoping to see indignation, hoping he would stand up and defend me. But he kept his gaze fixed on his plate, his cheeks slightly flushed, as if he were embarrassed to be publicly connected to me. The applause echoed through the hall as Claudia returned the microphone and sat down with a triumphant smile. Some people looked at me with pity, others with morbid curiosity, as if I were an animal in a zoo. My heart was beating so hard I thought everyone could hear it. My hands were shaking as I tried to take a sip of water, but even that simple gesture felt impossible under the weight of 200 pairs of eyes judging me. In that moment, something inside me broke. It wasn't dramatic or loud. It was like when an old pipe bursts inside a wall. You don't hear it until the water starts to seep through and stain everything it touches. I felt years of silence, of swallowing humiliations, of justifying the unjustifiable, begin to crack open in my chest. I stood up from the table on shaky legs, murmuring an apology to my table mates who barely noticed. I needed air, needed to escape all those gazes that were dissecting me like a rare specimen. I walked toward the restrooms, located in a building adjacent to the main hall. The stone path felt endless under my heels, each step a superhuman effort to maintain my composure. The tears started to fall before I could reach a private space. Once inside the white marble restroom, with its gold-framed mirrors and linen towels that probably cost more than my underwear, I locked myself in a stall and let the sobs consume me. I cried for the years I'd wasted believing that love was enough. I cried for the son I had raised who now seemed ashamed of my hard-working hands and my simple life. But most of all, I cried for myself, for the 20-year-old Teresa who worked 18-hour days dreaming of the day her sacrifice would be recognized. For the 30-year-old Teresa who sold pies in the rain, believing every dollar was an investment in a better future. For the 40-year-old Teresa who sewed until her eyes burned, convinced that a mother's love is always returned. When I came out of the restroom, my eyes swollen but my makeup fixed, I ran into Caroline, Claudia's mother, who was touching up her lipstick in the main mirror. "Teresa, dear," she said in a syrupy voice. "Everything all right? I saw you leave looking a little upset." "I'm perfectly fine," I lied, avoiding her gaze in the mirror. "I'm glad. It's just that Claudia's speech was so honest. Sometimes the truth hurts a little, but it's necessary, don't you think?" The truth. As if public humiliation were an act of honesty. "My daughter is very direct," Caroline continued, putting the lipstick back in her designer handbag. "She doesn't like hypocrisy. She believes in calling things by their name." She turned to me and looked me directly in the eyes for the first time all night. "Between us," she said, lowering her voice, "I think you've done an admirable job with Ethan, considering the circumstances. It must have been very difficult raising him alone, without resources, without a college education. Without a college education." Another stab disguised as understanding. "But he's in good hands now," she went on. "Claudia comes from a family that knows how to handle success, how to move in important circles. Ethan is going to learn a lot from us." The message was clear. "Your job here is done. We'll take it from here. I hope you can understand your place in this new stage of his life," she added with a purely condescending smile. "Young people need space to grow, to build their own path without baggage from the past. Baggage from the past. That's what I was to them. Baggage." I returned to the hall with legs like jelly and a shattered heart. The party was continuing as normal. Laughter filled the air. Waiters served elaborate desserts. Couples danced under colored lights. It was as if my humiliation had been just a brief intermission in a play that didn't concern me. I sat at my table and watched as Ethan and Claudia cut the cake, a 5-tiered tower decorated with sugar flowers that looked real. Camera flashes surrounded them as they fed each other the first bite, laughing like children in love. In that moment, Ethan looked happier than I had ever seen him. Was that what I had been doing wrong all these years? Had my love been a burden preventing him from shining his brightest? The music started and couples moved to the dance floor. Ethan and Claudia opened with a waltz they had clearly rehearsed, moving with an elegance that reminded me how different their world was from mine. Then their parents, their siblings, their friends joined in, entire families celebrating the young couple's love. I remained seated, invisible, watching my son live the most important day of his life surrounded by people who loved him but who believed I had no place in that celebration. It was then that I decided it was time to leave. No one would notice my absence. No one would come looking for me if I disappeared. It was better to leave with dignity before suffering any more humiliation. I headed for the exit, walking slowly so as not to draw attention. But just as I was about to reach the door, I heard my name. "Teresa, you're leaving already?" It was Ethan, approaching with Claudia on his arm. His face showed genuine surprise, as if he couldn't believe someone would leave his wedding. "It's late, son, and I have things to do tomorrow," I lied. "But we haven't had a chance to really talk. And there's still the mother-son dance." "Mother-son dance?" I hadn't seen that on the program they had given me. "I didn't know about that," I said. Claudia looked at me with a forced smile. "It's a lovely tradition, but optional, of course. We don't want to make anyone uncomfortable." Uncomfortable. That word again. "Besides," she added, "I think it's been a very intense night for you, hasn't it, Teresa? Maybe it's best you get some rest." Ethan nodded, clearly relieved that Claudia had given him an elegant way out. "You're right, Mom. It's been a long day for everyone." He kissed me on both cheeks, a quick, perfunctory gesture. "Thanks for coming. It means a lot to me to have you here." But his eyes were already back on the party, on the guests dancing and laughing, on his new life that had no real space for me. I walked to my Honda Civic under the starlight, the sound of music and laughter fading behind me. The cool night air hit my face like a cruel caress, reminding me that I was alive, that I had to keep breathing despite the pain eating me from the inside. Inside the car, before starting the engine, I sat for several minutes in silence. In the glove compartment was an envelope I had brought with me but hadn't had the courage to deliver. Inside was a check for $5,000, all my savings from the last 3 years, which I had planned to give them as a wedding gift. Money I had saved penny by penny, sewing late into the night, skimping on food and heating. But after tonight, after being introduced as an unambitious, unemployed woman in front of 200 strangers, after being treated like a nuisance at my own son's celebration, that money was staying with me. For the first time in my life, I was going to be selfish. And the very idea terrified me as much as it liberated me. The days following the wedding were the strangest of my life. Waking up in my small apartment in Harrisburg, the walls covered with photos of Ethan from a baby to his graduation, felt like living in a museum dedicated to someone who no longer existed. The silence was so thick I could touch it. I received no calls, no text asking if I had gotten home safely, no belated, "Thanks for coming, Mom." Nothing. It was as if after playing my part as an extra at his wedding, I had ceased to exist for him. I stayed in my pajamas for 3 days, drinking tea and staring out the window at the brick streets of the historic neighborhood. My neighbors walked by on their way to the market, with their shopping carts and their conversations about grandchildren and ailments. Normal life, simple life, the life that apparently made me baggage from the past. On the 4th day, the doorbell rang. It was Grace, holding a plate of homemade cookies and wearing that concerned look she got when she knew something was wrong. "Teresa, honey, you haven't been out in days. What happened at that wedding?" I told her everything. Every poisonous word, every dismissive glance, every moment I had felt out of place at my own son's celebration. Grace listened in silence, nodding at the right moments, squeezing my hand when my voice broke. "That boy has forgotten who he is," she said finally. "And that woman, she's the kind that tears families apart for sport. Do you think I'm overreacting, Grace? That I'm being too sensitive? Teresa, I've known you for 20 years. I've watched you work until you nearly dropped for that boy. And if you say they disrespected you, then they disrespected you." Her words were a balm on a wound that had started to fester with self-doubt. A week after the wedding, while organizing old papers in a desperate attempt to keep busy, I found something that would change my life forever. In a forgotten folder, between utility bills and bank statements, was an envelope I had received 3 months earlier, and had set aside unopened, thinking it was junk mail. The letterhead read, "Hernandez and Associates Asset Management." Inside was a letter dated in June, 2 months before the wedding. "Dear Mrs. Miller," the letter began, "we are writing to you on behalf of our client, the textile design firm American Traditions, Inc., based in New York." I continued reading, frowning, not understanding why a company from New York would be writing to me. "We became aware of your artisanal work through the Pennsylvania Crafts Fair, where we were able to observe samples of your embroidery and textile designs. We would like to propose a commercial collaboration for the production of a product line based on your traditional techniques." My heart began to race. A company from New York had seen my work? At the small fair where I had participated last year, selling embroidered placemats and napkins for $5 each. After a thorough evaluation of your portfolio, we believe your technique and designs are ideal for our Roots project, a high-end collection aimed at the international market. We would like to acquire the exclusive reproduction rights to your designs, as well as retain your services as a creative consultant. Exclusive rights. My hands trembled as I kept reading. The initial financial proposal is for $1.8 million payable in 3 installments, plus a 15% royalty on the net sales of the collection for the next 5 years. The paper fell from my hands. $1.8 million. For my embroidery. For the designs I had created during lonely nights after putting Ethan to bed, when my only entertainment was inventing new ways to combine threads and create patterns no one had ever seen. I reread the letter 5 times before my brain could fully process it. At the end, it said they awaited my response by September 30th to proceed with signing the contract. I cursed. It was September 15th. I had been ignoring the opportunity of a lifetime for 3 months because the letter had arrived when I was too focused on the wedding preparations, too nervous about fitting into Claudia's elegant world. With trembling hands, I found the phone number on the letter and dialed. A professional voice answered. Hernandez and Associates, good morning. Good morning. My name is Teresa Miller. I received a letter about a textile design contract. One moment, please. The wait felt eternal. Then, a kind masculine voice came on the line. Mrs. Miller, this is Alejandro Hernandez. We thought you had decided not to participate in the project. We're so glad to hear from you. It's just that I just found the letter. I didn't know. Don't worry, we're still on schedule. Would you be interested in meeting to discuss the details? 2 days later, I took the Acela train to New York for the first time in my life. I wore my best suit, the same navy blue one from the wedding but with a new white blouse, and carried a portfolio with all my original designs that I had kept for years like secret treasures. The offices of Hernandez and Associates were on Park Avenue, in a modern building with glass elevators and marble floors that reflected the light like mirrors. I felt small and insignificant walking through those halls, but for the first time in months, it wasn't an unpleasant feeling. It was the anticipation of someone about to discover something new about herself. Alejandro Hernandez was a man in his 40s, elegant but warm, who treated me with a respect I hadn't felt in a long time. He explained that they had been searching for authentic artisans for their new line, designers who worked with traditional techniques but had a contemporary sensibility. Your work is extraordinary, Mrs. Miller, he said, reviewing my design portfolio. This embroidery has impeccable technical quality, but more importantly, it has soul. You can tell there's a story behind every stitch. A story. Years of sleepless nights, of sore fingers, of creating beauty in the midst of hardship. Yes, there was a story. He explained that the company had already done market research. My designs had the potential to sell in high-end stores in Paris, Milan, New York. Luxury goods that celebrated traditional American craftsmanship with a contemporary twist. The initial contract is for 5 years, he explained. $1.8 million plus royalties. But this is just the beginning. If the line performs as we expect, we'll be talking about much larger figures. When I left that meeting, with the signed contract and a check for $600,000 as the first payment, I walked through Times Square as if I were floating. People rushed past me, speaking languages I didn't understand, buying souvenirs, living their normal lives, unaware that the older woman with the cloth bag had just become a millionaire. On the train ride back to Harrisburg, I stared out the window at the passing Pennsylvania countryside and thought of all the times Ethan had told me I had no ambition, that I was content with little. Of all the times Claudia had spoken of my limitations. Now, in my purse, I had the document that proved I had built something valuable with my own hands, that my work wasn't just pretty sewing, but art that international companies wanted to buy, that the unemployed woman who didn't do much else had just signed a contract that likely surpassed the annual salary of her successful son. But strangely, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt a mixture of anger and sadness that ate at me like acid. Because if I had possessed this talent all along, if my work was worth millions of dollars, why had no one in my own family ever valued it? Why did it take a stranger from a corporation to tell me that what I did was extraordinary? When I got home, I sat in my small kitchen with a cup of chamomile tea and the contract spread out on the Formica table. The numbers seemed unreal under the light of the ceiling lamp that had been flickering for years. $1.8 million. More money than I had seen in my entire life. For the first time in decades, I didn't have to worry about the electric bill, about whether I had enough money for groceries, about whether I could afford to replace my falling-apart shoes. I was free, financially free, but freedom was terrifying when you've spent your whole life as a prisoner of necessity. I couldn't sleep that night. I lay awake thinking about all the times Ethan had come home from visiting Claudia's family, talking about their important contacts, about the business opportunities that came up at their elegant dinners, as if success was something that could only be found in exclusive circles, not at the kitchen table where his mother created beauty with a needle and thread. 3 days later, while organizing my new bank documents, the phone rang. It was Ethan. "Hi, Mom. How are you?" His voice sounded different, less warm, like a courtesy call he'd rather avoid. "I'm fine, son. And you? How was the honeymoon?" "It was great. We went to Santorini. Beautiful." An awkward pause. The kind of silence that forms when two people who once told each other everything no longer know what to say. "Mom, I'm calling because, well, Claudia and I have been talking and—" Another pause. My stomach clenched. "We think it would be best if we had some space. So we can settle into married life without interference." Interference? I was an interference in his married life. What kind of space, Ethan? "Well, maybe it's not necessary for us to see each other so often, or for you to call me every week. It's just that Claudia feels a little overwhelmed, and so do I, to be honest. Overwhelmed. By a mother who called her son once a week." "I understand," I lied. "It's nothing personal, Mom. It's just that we need time for ourselves. To create our own family traditions, Our own family traditions. As if the traditions he and I had built over 26 years were an obstacle to his happiness. "All right, Ethan. I'll do whatever you think is best." "Thanks, Mom. I knew you'd understand." After I hung up, I sat with the phone in my hand for a long time. My son, the boy I had given everything to, had just asked me to quietly disappear from his life. And the most painful part was that he had done it with the same polite distance one would use with a persistent telemarketer. That night, for the first time in my life, I didn't cook. I ordered a pizza from a local delivery place and ate it straight from the box, sitting on the couch, watching a TV show without paying any attention to the plot. It was a small act of rebellion that made me feel like a teenager getting into trouble. The days began to pass differently. Without the routine of worrying about Ethan, without the weekly calls to ask how he was, without planning what I would cook when he visited, my life felt empty, but also, for the first time in decades, my own. I decided to use some of the contract money to do something I had never allowed myself. I renovated my apartment. I hired a young decorator who helped me pick out new furniture, fresh paint, and elegant curtains that filtered the light beautifully. I bought a professional sewing machine, a modern singer with all the features I had dreamed of for years. For the first time in my life, my home wasn't just functional. It was beautiful. I also bought new clothes. Not the practical, cheap clothes I had worn for decades, but elegant pieces that fit me well and made me feel attractive. A professional hairstylist cut my hair in layers that framed my face and taught me how to apply makeup in a way that highlighted my eyes instead of hiding my age. When I looked in the mirror, I saw a woman who had been buried for years under the constant worry for others. A Teresa who had existed before she became just Ethan's mom. A month after the wedding, I received an unexpected call. It was Caroline, Claudia's mother. "Teresa, dear, how are you? I hope you don't mind me calling you directly." Her voice had that artificial sweetness I already knew. "Not at all, Caroline. How can I help you?" "Well, it's a rather delicate situation. It turns out Ethan and Claudia are having some financial troubles. You know how young people are, always spending more than they earn. Financial troubles. Ethan earned more in a month than I had in a year before the contract. The thing is, they've found a beautiful house in Scarsdale. You know the area?" A very exclusive neighborhood. But they need help with the down payment. And we thought that perhaps you could lend them a hand. Lend them a hand. As if I owed them something. How much do they need? I asked, curious to hear the figure. It's not much, just $150,000. For you, without any major expenses, I'm sure it's manageable. $150,000. Not much for a woman who had lived on a few $100s a month for years. Caroline, may I ask you something? Of course, dear. Why do you think I have that kind of money? A nervous laugh on the other end of the line. Well, we figured you've been saving all these years. And now that Ethan is independent, you can afford to help him get properly settled. There it was again. The assumption that my sole purpose in life was to serve my son and that any resource I had should automatically be at his disposal. I see, I said. And do they know you're calling me? Of course. It was Claudia's idea, actually. She said you would surely prefer a direct request for help, rather than having Ethan feel uncomfortable asking you himself. How considerate. Claudia had delegated the task of asking me for money to her mother to spare Ethan the discomfort of having to speak to me. Caroline, I need to think about it. I'll call you in a few days. Of course, dear. But don't take too long. You know how the real estate market is. Good opportunities go fast. After I hung up, I laughed out loud. A bitter laugh that came from my gut and tasted like freedom. The same woman who had treated me like an ignorant peasant at the wedding was now calling me dear and asking me to finance her daughter's real estate whim. That night, I drafted my response. Not a call, but a letter sent by certified mail, so there would be a record. Dear Caroline, I wrote, I have carefully considered your request for financial assistance for Ethan and Claudia. After reflecting on everyone's needs, I have decided that at this time I cannot commit that amount of money. I suggest they explore other financing options. Sincerely, Teresa. I signed the letter with my best handwriting and sent it off with a sense of power I had never experienced before. For the first time in my life, I had said no to someone asking for money for my son. The response was swift. 2 days later, my phone rang insistently. It was Ethan, and his voice had a tone I hadn't heard since he was a teenager. Angry when I wouldn't buy him something he wanted. Mom, what is this about you not helping us with the house? Not even a hello. Straight to the point, as if he were my boss reprimanding me for a poorly done job. Hello, son. How are you? Don't change the subject. Caroline showed us your letter. I don't understand what's gotten into you lately. Nothing has gotten into me, Ethan. I simply believe that $150,000 is a lot of money. But Mom, it's for a house. For our future. It's not like we're asking for money for frivolous things. A house in Scarsdale wasn't a frivolous thing. Of course not. Son, you have a very good salary. Why don't you apply for a mortgage like everyone else? Because we want a good house, not just any old thing. And with interest rates the way they are? Besides, I thought you'd be happy to be able to help us. There it was. Emotional manipulation disguised as financial logic. Were you happy to help me when I was humiliated at your wedding? A long silence on the other end of the line. What? Your wife introduced me as an unemployed woman with no ambition in front of 200 strangers. Ethan. And you said nothing. Mom, don't exaggerate. Claudia didn't mean anything by it. She didn't mean anything by it? She said I don't work and don't do much else. She talked about the limitations of my background, all while you just sat there in silence. It's just, well, technically you don't work for a company, right? And Claudia is very direct. You know how she is. Technically, you don't work for a company. My own son reduced my entire working life to a technicality. Ethan, have you ever wondered how I paid for your education? Your food? Your clothes? Your trips with your friends? Of course I know, Mom, and I'm grateful. But that was then. Things are different now. Yes, they are different. Now it turns out you need my money but not my presence. That's not it. It's just that Claudia and I need to establish our own life, and that life doesn't include your mother? Another silence. Longer this time. Mom, don't be so dramatic. Of course we want you in our lives, but in your proper place. My proper place. And what exactly was my proper place? That of the old woman who shows up at Christmas with gifts and disappears discreetly when she's no longer needed. And what is my proper place, Ethan? Well, I don't know. The place of a normal mother. Who visits once in a while? Who comes to family dinners? Who finances your real estate whims? They're not whims. It's an investment in our future. And I thought you'd be happy to contribute. There it was again. The idea that I should feel happy to be able to serve, to give, to sacrifice myself for his well-being. Ethan, do you have any idea how much money I have? I don't know, Mom. We've never talked about money. I assume you've been saving over the years. Have you ever wondered what I live on? How I pay my rent, my food, my clothes? An uncomfortable silence. I guess, I don't know, that you have your own income. My income. My 26-year-old son had no idea how his mother survived financially. My income, Ethan, comes from sewing, from the embroidery and alterations I do for people in the neighborhood. $20 to hem a pair of pants, $50 to embroider a tablecloth. That's how I've lived all these years. Well, yeah, that's why I'm saying you can help us now. You don't have to worry about supporting me anymore. The conversation had taken a surreal turn. My son truly believed that his support had been my only expense all these years. And now that he was no longer a burden, my money was automatically available to finance his new life of luxury. Ethan, I'm going to hang up now because this conversation is hurting me more than I can bear. Mom, wait. Don't be angry. I just don't understand why you don't want to help us. It's not that I don't want to. It's that I can't. It was a lie, of course. Technically, I could. But there was something deeper preventing me. It was as if handing over that money would mean handing over the last remnants of my dignity. You can't? Or you won't? Both, son. I can't because that money is my security for the future. And I won't because you haven't given me a single reason to. I'm your son. Isn't that reason enough? Being my son used to be reason enough, back when you treated me like your mother and not like an inconvenient stranger. I hung up the phone before he could reply. I sat there in my new kitchen, with my elegant furniture and my beautiful curtains, trembling with equal parts rage and sadness. I couldn't eat dinner that night. I made myself a chamomile tea and sat in my new chair to embroider. It was a new design I had started, inspired by the sunflowers that grew in the fields outside Harrisburg. Each stitch was a meditation, each color a small decision that only I could make. As I embroidered, I thought about all the times I had given in, had said yes when I wanted to say no, had given when I had nothing left to give, and I realized that I had raised a son who expected that of me, that I had conditioned my love on my capacity for sacrifice, and now he didn't know how to relate to me in any other way. A week later, I received an unexpected visitor. It was Claudia, alone, dressed in an expensive designer suit and a smile that fooled no one. Teresa, can we talk? I let her into my renovated living room. I watched as her eyes scanned the new furniture, the elegant curtains, the large-screen TV I had allowed myself to buy for the first time in my life. You've made some interesting changes, she said, unable to hide her surprise. Thank you. Can I get you something to drink? No, thank you. I can't stay long. She sat on the edge of the sofa, as if she were afraid of catching something. Teresa, I came to talk to you woman to woman about this situation with Ethan. Woman to woman, as if we were friends conspiring over intimate secrets. Look, I understand you might be a little resentful about some things that happened at the wedding. A little resentful. The public humiliation reduced to a minor misunderstanding. But I think you're punishing Ethan for something that really wasn't that big of a deal. Oh, really? Teresa, you have to understand that Ethan is at a very important stage of his life. He's building his career, his marriage, his future. And he needs his family's support, not obstacles. Obstacles. That word again. And how exactly am I an obstacle? Well, with this attitude of not wanting to help us financially, Ethan is very confused. He doesn't understand why his own mother would deny him something so basic. Something so basic. As if giving them $150,000 was the equivalent of making them dinner. Claudia, may I ask you something? Of course. What have you done to deserve my money?